Harlem, New York. In the most unexpected alliance in New York City's history, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the 58-year-old gangster who has controlled Harlem's criminal underworld for 3 decades, has become the secret protector of Malcolm X, the controversial Nation of Islam minister whose inflammatory speeches about white America have made him one of the most hunted men in the country. Last night, at approximately 9:47 p.m., 2 men armed with .38 caliber revolvers attempted to ambush Malcolm X as he left the Nation of Islam's mosque number 7 on Lenox Avenue, but before the assassins could fire, they were shot and killed by 3 men identified by multiple witnesses as members of Bumpy Johnson's organization, marking the 3rd time in 6 weeks that Johnson's underworld network has intervened to prevent Malcolm's murder and raising extraordinary questions about why Harlem's most feared criminal has appointed himself guardian of Harlem's most radical voice. The scene outside Mosque number 7 last night was chaos. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, formerly known as Detroit Red, the man who preaches that white people are devils and who calls for black separation rather than integration, emerged from evening services accompanied by 2 Nation of Islam security guards when witnesses report seeing 2 men step from a parked Chevrolet sedan approximately 40 feet away, both men pulling revolvers and raising them toward Malcolm. But before either assassin could fire, gunshots erupted from a different direction, from a black Cadillac parked across the street, and both would-be assassins were struck multiple times, falling to the pavement as Malcolm's security guards rushed him back inside the mosque while the Cadillac sped away into Harlem's night. Police arriving at the scene found both assassins dead, later identified as Raymond Butler, 31, and Thomas Hayer, 27, both members of the Nation of Islam's Newark Temple, who had reportedly been heard threatening Malcolm's life after Malcolm's break with Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad. Witnesses reported that the shots came from 3 colored men in a Cadillac who fled immediately after the shooting, and multiple sources within Harlem's community have confirmed to the Herald that the shooters were William Bub Hewlett, Theodore Teddy Green, and Raymond Junie Bird, all known associates of Bumpy Johnson, all experienced killers with decades of violence in Johnson's service, all now apparently serving as Malcolm X's unauthorized security force despite having no connection to the Nation of Islam, and despite Malcolm's frequent denunciations of gambling, drugs, and criminality that Johnson's empire is built upon. This marks the 3rd confirmed intervention by Johnson's organization in 6 weeks. May 15th, 2 Nation of Islam members who had been following Malcolm for 3 days were beaten unconscious by Johnson's men and dumped in the Bronx with warning messages carved into their backs. Stay away from Malcolm or die. June 8th. A bomb planted beneath Malcolm's car was discovered and defused by Johnson's associates before Malcolm could start the vehicle. The device was sophisticated enough that police believe it would have killed Malcolm and anyone within 30 feet of the explosion. June 23rd, last night. The assassination attempt outside Mosque number 7 was prevented by Johnson's men killing the assassins before they could fire. The alliance, if it can be called that, appears to have begun in early May 1963, shortly after Malcolm X's increasingly public conflict with Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad escalated from theological disagreement to existential threat. Sources close to both men report that Malcolm, recognizing that the nation's Chicago headquarters had essentially ordered his death, reached out to the one man in Harlem powerful enough to resist the nation's considerable reach. Bumpy Johnson, the gangster who controls policy gambling, narcotics distribution, and various other criminal enterprises generating an estimated $8 million annually, and who maintains a private army of over 200 enforcers, collectors, and associates whose loyalty is absolute and whose willingness to use lethal violence is legendary throughout New York's criminal underworld. According to sources who spoke to the Herald on condition of absolute anonymity for fear of retaliation from either Johnson's organization or from the Nation of Islam, the first meeting between Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson occurred on May 3, 1963, at a location in Harlem that sources would not specify. The meeting was requested by Malcolm through intermediaries, members of Harlem's legitimate business community who maintained relationships with both men, and lasted approximately 2 hours, during which Malcolm explained his situation, and Johnson agreed to provide protection despite the two men representing seemingly incompatible worldviews. One source described the meeting's dynamic. Malcolm told Bumpy straight up, "The nation wants me dead. Chicago has put out the word. I've got maybe 3 months before they succeed. I need protection, but I can't pay you. The nation took everything when I left. All I can offer is that when this is over, if I survive, I'll owe you a debt that I'll spend the rest of my life repaying." And Bumpy just smoked his cigar for a minute, looking at Malcolm, and then he said, "Brother Malcolm, you don't owe me nothing. Harlem protects its own. You're one of us. Whether you're preaching in a mosque or running numbers on a corner, anybody wants to kill you, they go through me first." The source continued, "It wasn't about money for Bumpy. It was about respect. Malcolm had spent years telling black people in Harlem to be proud, to stand up, to stop accepting second-class citizenship. And Bumpy recognized that Malcolm was doing something important, something that mattered more than gambling or hustling. So Bumpy decided to protect him, not as a business arrangement, but as a matter of principle. To understand this extraordinary alliance, one must understand the conflict that has made Malcolm X one of the most hunted men in America. Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam in 1952 while serving a prison sentence for burglary in Massachusetts. He was recruited by his brother Reginald, who introduced him to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the nation's leader who preaches that white people are inherently evil, devils created by an evil scientist named Yaqub, that black people are the original human race, and that black Americans should establish a separate nation rather than seeking integration with white society. Malcolm, brilliant and charismatic, rose rapidly through the nation's hierarchy, becoming minister of Mosque No. 7 in Harlem in 1954 and becoming the nation's most effective recruiter and most visible spokesperson, growing the organization from approximately 500 members in 1952 to over 30,000 members by 1963. But Malcolm's relationship with Elijah Muhammad began deteriorating in 1962 when Malcolm learned that Muhammad, who preached strict moral codes, including absolute prohibition of adultery, had fathered multiple children with young secretaries in the nation's Chicago headquarters. Malcolm, deeply disillusioned, began quietly questioning Muhammad's leadership, and when Malcolm made controversial public comments in December 1963 about President Kennedy's assassination, describing it as chickens coming home to roost, Muhammad used the controversy as pretext to silence Malcolm, suspending him from speaking for 90 days. Malcolm recognized the suspension was actually the first step toward his permanent removal, either through expulsion from the nation or through assassination. In March 1963, Malcolm announced he was leaving the Nation of Islam to form his own organization, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and almost immediately the threats began. Nation of Islam officials in Chicago were heard saying Malcolm should be dealt with and won't live much longer. Nation members in various temples were encouraged to view Malcolm as traitor deserving of death. And Malcolm, who had no personal security force, the nation controlled all security resources, and who had limited financial resources, the nation owned his home and had provided his salary, found himself extraordinarily vulnerable to an organization that had proven willing to use violence against perceived enemies and that now viewed Malcom as its greatest enemy. Bumpy Johnson, 58 years old, is everything Malcolm X theoretically opposes. A career criminal who profits from gambling addiction that destroys black families, who distributes narcotics that poison black communities, who uses violence to maintain control over illegal enterprises that should not exist. Malcolm has preached for years that men like Johnson are obstacles to black liberation, are symptoms of the moral degradation that slavery and segregation have inflicted on black communities, are examples of what black men become when they abandon righteousness in pursuit of material wealth. And yet Johnson, who returned to Harlem in 1963 after serving a decade at Alcatraz Federal Prison for narcotics conspiracy, has become Malcolm's most effective protector, deploying resources and using methods that dwarf anything the Nation of Islam could mobilize. Johnson's protection network includes 24-hour surveillance of Malcolm's movements, with at least 4 of Johnson's men following Malcolm at all times, positioned to intervene if threats emerge. Intelligence gathering about Nation of Islam activities, with Johnson's associates infiltrating nation temples, bribing nation members for information about planned attacks, intercepting communications between Chicago headquarters and New York operatives, counter-intimidation against nation members who threaten Malcolm, with Johnson's enforcers delivering beatings, threats, and in some cases lethal violence against individuals identified as potential assassins. Safe houses throughout Harlem where Malcolm can retreat if immediate danger emerges, locations unknown to the nation and protected by Johnson's armed guards. Financial support for Malcolm's new organization, with Johnson reportedly providing $10,000 in cash to help Malcolm establish Muslim Mosque, Inc., and to support Malcolm's family after the nation cut off his income. The protection operation is sophisticated and expensive. Sources estimate Johnson is spending $5,000 to $8,000 monthly on Malcolm's security, a substantial investment with no financial return, demonstrating that Johnson's motivations are not commercial, but are instead rooted in something more complex. A combination of respect for Malcolm's courage, recognition of Malcolm's importance to Harlem's community, and perhaps a desire by Johnson to protect something valuable that his own criminal life has never produced. The Johnson-Malcolm alliance has created extraordinary complications for multiple organizations. The FBI is closely monitoring the relationship. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau has maintained extensive surveillance of Malcolm X since 1953, viewing him as potential threat to national security due to his racial rhetoric, and has maintained equally extensive surveillance of Johnson since the 1940s, viewing him as major organized crime figure. The fact that these two targets are now collaborating has triggered urgent intelligence gathering efforts to understand whether the alliance represents new threat, a potential merger of organized crime resources with black nationalist ideology, or whether it represents merely personal protection arrangement with no broader implications. FBI Assistant Director William Sullivan issued an internal memo this morning, obtained by the Herald, stating, "The Johnson-Malcolm X relationship represents unprecedented cooperation between criminal underworld and radical political movement. We must determine whether this alliance extends beyond personal protection to include financial support for subversive activities, weapons acquisition, or planning of violent actions against government targets. All field offices should increase surveillance of both subjects and report any evidence of broadening cooperation. The Nation of Islam faces a dilemma. Continuing to pursue Malcolm's assassination will require confronting Johnson's organization, which would trigger gang warfare that the nation cannot win. The nation has perhaps 30,000 members nationally, but has limited capacity for sustained violence, while Johnson controls a professional criminal organization experienced in warfare and willing to use lethal force without hesitation. Several Nation of Islam temples in New York have reportedly received warnings from Johnson's representatives. Any further attempts on Malcolm's life will result in retaliation against nation leadership, with Johnson's enforcers targeting nation officials in Chicago, Detroit, and other cities until the assassination campaign stops. The civil rights movement is uncertain how to respond. Mainstream civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and Whitney Young of the Urban League, have long maintained distance from Malcolm X, viewing his separatist rhetoric and his denunciations of nonviolence as counterproductive to integration efforts. The fact that Malcolm is now protected by a gangster reinforces the perception that Malcolm represents a dangerous criminal element within black activism rather than legitimate civil rights advocacy. When contacted by the Herald, NAACP spokesman declined to comment on the Johnson-Malcolm alliance, stating only, "The NAACP does not condone violence or criminal activity in pursuit of civil rights objectives." Harlem's community is divided but largely supportive. While ministers and legitimate business leaders publicly express concern about criminal involvement in community affairs, many ordinary Harlem residents view Johnson's protection of Malcolm as evidence that the streets value Malcolm's message, even if establishment figures do not. One Harlem resident, interviewed outside the Apollo Theater, stated, "Malcolm tells the truth about white people, about what they've done to us, and the white power structure wants him silenced. His own religious people turned on him. So if Bumpy Johnson is the only one with the power to keep Malcolm alive, then God bless Bumpy Johnson. Malcolm's voice matters more than anyone's comfort with how he's being protected." Malcolm X, contacted by the Herald through intermediaries, he is in hiding and his location is closely guarded, provided the following statement: "I do not condone criminal activity. I have spent my adult life teaching black people to reject the hustling lifestyle that white supremacy has forced upon our communities. But I also recognize reality. The Nation of Islam, the organization I helped build, now wants me dead. The federal government, which should protect citizens from assassination, instead watches and takes notes. The civil rights establishment, which should defend freedom of speech, instead distances itself from any black voice that makes white people uncomfortable. In this situation, the only institution in Harlem with the power and the will to protect me from assassination is the institution that white society calls criminal, but that provides more real security to black people than police or courts or politicians ever have. Brother Johnson is doing what he believes is right. I cannot reject his protection when no alternative exists. When this is over, if I survive, I will work to repay the debt I owe him by helping to free black people from the very vices that men like him profit from. But today, I am alive because the streets protect me when my own brothers hunt me." Bumpy Johnson declined to comment directly to the Herald, but sources close to him report that Johnson views the protection arrangement as consistent with his long-standing role in Harlem's community. One source stated, "Bumpy doesn't think of himself as a criminal. He thinks of himself as someone who provides services that Harlem needs and that white society refuses to provide legitimately. He provides gambling when people need hope. He provides loans when banks won't lend to colored people. He provides security when police won't protect colored neighborhoods. Protecting Malcolm is just another service, keeping alive a voice that Harlem needs, that speaks truth that nobody else will speak. Bumpy respects that, even if he doesn't agree with everything Malcolm says about gambling and hustling. He respects the courage it takes to stand up like Malcolm does. The future. Can this alliance hold? The central question facing law enforcement, civil rights organizations, and Harlem's community is whether the Johnson-Malcolm alliance can survive the pressures it faces. Financial pressure. Johnson is spending thousands monthly with no return, a cost that cannot be sustained indefinitely without affecting his criminal operations. Violence pressure. The Nation of Islam has enormous pride invested in silencing Malcolm. Backing down would represent humiliating defeat that may be unacceptable regardless of cost. Legal pressure. FBI surveillance of both men will intensify, creating risks of prosecution that may force Johnson to withdraw protection to avoid additional charges. Philosophical pressure. The fundamental contradiction between Malcolm's message, black people must reject criminality and vice, and Johnson's livelihood, profiting from criminality and vice, cannot be ignored indefinitely. Either Malcolm must soften his anti-crime message, or Johnson must accept that protecting Malcolm undermines his own business interests. Multiple sources suggest the alliance is temporary, designed to protect Malcolm through the immediate crisis, but not intended as permanent arrangement. One source stated, "Bumpy knows Malcolm is going to keep preaching against gambling and drugs, and Malcolm knows that eventually he'll have to criticize the very man who's keeping him alive. They both understand this can't last. But right now, Malcolm needs protection and Bumpy is providing it. They'll deal with the contradictions later if Malcolm survives long enough for there to be a later." The alliance between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X represents something unprecedented in American history. The criminal underworld actively protecting a revolutionary voice that threatens the social order both underworld and establishment depend upon. Malcolm preaches black self-determination, rejection of white supremacy, and moral righteousness that condemns the very activities Johnson profits from. And yet Johnson protects Malcolm because, in his own way, Johnson recognizes that Malcolm's voice matters, that Malcolm articulates truths about black American life that need to be heard, and that silencing Malcolm would represent a loss for Harlem that transcends business considerations. Whether this alliance represents the beginning of broader cooperation between Harlem's criminal and political elements, or whether it represents merely temporary expedients in unique circumstances, remains to be seen. What is clear is that last night, outside Mosque No. 7, 2 men died who intended to kill Malcolm X, and they died because Harlem's most feared criminal decided that Malcolm's life was worth protecting, even at the cost of violence, even at the cost of his own security, even at the cost of ideological contradiction that cannot be easily resolved. Malcolm X lives today because Bumpy Johnson willed it. How long Johnson can continue willing it, and what price both men will ultimately pay for this unlikely alliance, are questions that only time will answer.